Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we ease into the life of a warrior king, a man whose name still echoes with the clatter of swords and the roar of victory. Picture yourself now, not in your bed, but in a grimy, flickering tavern in 15th century London. The air is thick with the smell of spilled ale and unwashed wool. You're huddled in a corner, watching a scene unfold that would make your history teacher blush. There, laughing louder than anyone, is Prince Hal, the future King Henry V, a man whose legend is as much about the unruly youth as it is about the glorious king. He's surrounded by a crew of lowlifes and rabble-rousers, a world away from the stately court his father commands. He is, to put it mildly, a bit of a mess, and you, in this moment, are watching a future king who, by all accounts, probably won't survive the night, let alone the throne. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with your location and the local time. It's always good to know where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the shadow of a truly staggering figure, a king whose reign was so brief, yet so monumental that it feels like a fever dream. But before we get to the glory of Agincourt, you must first understand the boy who became the man. You see, the story of Henry V doesn't begin with a crown, but with a scandal. For most of his youth, Henry, or Prince Hal, was the black sheep of the royal family. He wasn't just a bit rebellious. He was a full-on card-carrying troublemaker. The taverns of Eastcheap were his kingdom. The rogue Sir John Falstaff was his best friend, and his days were spent in a blur of drinking, brawling, and general debauchery. This isn't just a bit of fictional embellishment either. The historical fact is that his father, King Henry IV, was so utterly exasperated by his son's behaviour that he seriously considered disinheriting him and making one of his younger sons his heir instead. It's a testament to how far gone Prince Hal seemed, a prince who was more comfortable with cut purses than counts. His father, Henry Bolingbroke, had his own ghost to contend with. He was a usurper, a man who had seized the throne from his cousin, King Richard II. Richard wasn't a great king, but his death at the hands of Henry Bolingbroke stained the new king's reign with the persistent stench of illegitimacy. It's a bit like taking over a family business after locking your cousin in the basement. You might be a better CEO, but everyone whispers about how you got the job. This is the heavy, tarnished legacy that weighs on Henry V from the moment he's born. The crown he's destined to wear isn't a symbol of divine right. It's a constant reminder of a broken oath and a stolen kingdom. His entire reign would be a desperate attempt to legitimise his father's coup, to prove that his family had a God-given right to rule England, not just the military might to take it. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about this period is the sheer number of wild rumours that swirled around Prince Hal's youthful antics. According to one account, he once had a falling out with a member of his entourage and in a fit of rage, drew his sword and struck him. When the Chief Justice of England, a man named William Gascoigne, tried to intervene, Prince Hal reportedly struck him too. This might be a bit of folklore, but it speaks to the very real reputation he had for being volatile and unpredictable. Think of it as the 15th century equivalent of a royal court on CCTV drunkenly punching a bouncer. The gossip would have been off the charts. His reputation was so poor that when the old king finally died, many in the court and throughout England genuinely feared that the country was about to be plunged into a new era of chaos with this party prince on the throne. You can almost feel the collective holding of breath as the news of Henry IV's death spreads. The old king, ravaged by a mysterious illness that some historians believe was leprosy, had finally succumbed, and there, at his bedside, stands the very son who had caused him so much grief. What happens next is a turning point that still sparks debate. Historians still argue whether Henry's transformation was an instantaneous and genuine moment of spiritual awakening, or a shrewd, calculated move of a man who was always far more intelligent than anyone gave him credit for. The traditional story, and the one Shakespeare immortalised, is that he had a dramatic overnight conversion. He cast off his old friends, including the lovable rogue Falstaff, and swore to be a king worthy of the crown. It's a powerful narrative, a story of redemption that's almost too perfect. But what if it was all a performance? What if Prince Hal was always a master of manipulation, and his wild youth was just a mask? Perhaps his time in the taverns wasn't a sign of immaturity, but a clever way to understand the common man, to build a network of informants and to learn the pulse of the kingdom from the bottom up. It's a compelling thought. Maybe the wild behaviour was a brilliant disguise for a brilliant mind. When he finally took the throne, the surprise and relief among the nobles would have been immense, solidifying his power and leaving no one in doubt that this was a new kind of king. This kind of calculated transformation would be a powerful tool for a man who desperately needed to prove his legitimacy. After all, he had a kingdom to rule, a family name to cleanse, and an overwhelming sense of insecurity at the heart of his power. The very first acts of his reign would be a testament to this new, serious Henry. He had to deal with the legacy of his father's reign, which was littered with rebellions and resentments. He had to contend with the remnants of the old regime, the ghosts of Richard II. He had to prove to a sceptical nobility and a nervous populace that he was not the dissolute boy they knew, but a righteous and capable leader. The weight of that expectation, the burden of a stolen crown, is something you can almost feel pressing down on him. This is not a man born to privilege, he is a man who must earn his respect, and in an era where power was everything, that meant projecting strength, piety, and absolute control. This brings us back to that dingy tavern and the image of a young man, a future king, who seemed to have no future at all. The transformation from that messy, brawling youth to the man who would one day command an army across the sea is one of the most remarkable personal narratives in all of history. And it all begins here, with a tarnished legacy and a deeply flawed past he must either redeem or conquer. This is the king you're getting to know. You now find yourself standing in the grand, hallowed halls of Westminster Abbey, not amidst the clinking of ale mugs, but the solemn hush of a coronation. The air, once thick with the smell of spilled beer and tavern smoke, now carries the scent of incense and old stone. The party prince is gone. In his place stands a new king, Henry V, draped in heavy ceremonial robes, the weight of the crown settling upon his head. But the crown isn't just a symbol of power. It's a hot, burning ember placed on a head, already heavy with the burden of his father's usurped legacy. You can almost feel the tension in the room. There are nobles here who remember Richard II, men who have felt the sting of Henry IV's reign, and they are all watching, waiting to see if this new, untested king will be just as weak, just as insecure as his father. Henry's first challenges upon his ascension are immediate and immense. His father, Henry IV, had spent his entire reign putting down rebellions. The country was in a state of political exhaustion, and there were powerful figures, particularly the Percy family in the north, who still resented the Lancastrian dynasty. Henry V, in a move that both surprised and impressed his court, immediately showed a different kind of leadership. One of his first acts was to make a public show of piety and reconciliation. He had the body of the late King Richard II, the man his father had overthrown and likely had a hand in killing, reinterred with full honours at Westminster Abbey. This was not a small gesture. It was a direct attempt to heal the deep wounds of the past, a kind of historical olive branch extended to a resentful nobility and a still divided populace. It was a calculated move to show that the new king was not defined by his father's sins. The historical fact is that Henry V's coronation was not a smooth affair. He inherited a near-bankrupt treasury and a kingdom rife with internal strife. The Welsh, under the charismatic leader Owain Glyndwr, were still in active rebellion, a long and bloody conflict that had drained the English crown for years. The Lollards, a religious reform movement, were gaining strength and challenging the authority of the church, and lurking in the shadows were political rivals, ambitious nobles, and a French court that viewed the Lancastrian line as illegitimate. This was the landscape he inherited. It's a bit like taking over a Fortune 500 company that's on the verge of bankruptcy, with a mutinous board of directors and an angry mob of shareholders. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about this period is the widespread belief that King Henry IV's final illness was a divine punishment for his actions. Some historians believe his mysterious and debilitating skin condition was leprosy, a disease often associated with moral sin in the medieval mind. This belief in a kind of righteous retribution for the usurpation of the throne would have only added to the feeling of illegitimacy surrounding Henry V. He wasn't just inheriting a kingdom, he was inheriting a kingdom with a curse on it. His every move had to be not just politically astute, but also morally unimpeachable. He had to be a king not just by blood, but by God's grace, a stark contrast to his father's reputation. This leads to a point of scholarly debate that still fascinates historians. Historians still argue whether Henry's aggressive claim to the French throne was a preemptive strike to unite a divided England or a genuine belief in his own rightful claim. Was it a diversionary tactic? A way to turn the internal strife into external aggression? By focusing the nation's attention on a foreign enemy, Henry could unite the disparate factions under a single banner and a single purpose. A successful war would legitimize his rule, fill his empty treasury with plunder, and provide a glorious legacy that would overshadow his father's messy rise to power. It's a compelling argument, one that paints Henry as a brilliant strategist, a man who saw the French claim not just as a right, but as a solution to all of his problems. Think about it from his perspective. You have a nobility that is divided, a treasury that is empty, and a nation that is tired of war. What do? You don't shy away from conflict. You create one on your own terms. The French crown, with its wealth and its symbolic power, was the perfect prize. It was a high-stakes gamble, but for a king whose entire reign was built on the shaky ground of usurpation, it was a risk worth taking. And so, in the quiet corridors of Westminster, the whispers of legitimacy and the ghosts of Richard II begin to be replaced by the strategic whispers of war and conquest. The king, who was once a wild, undisciplined boy, is now a cold, calculating man, weighing his options not in terms of what's right, but in terms of what's necessary for survival. This shift in focus from domestic reconciliation to foreign aggression is a core part of Henry's early reign. He understood that a king's power was not just about control, but about perception. He had to be seen as strong, pious, and above all successful. He began a methodical campaign to stabilise his court and consolidate his power. He reconciled with the Percy family, he addressed the Lollard threat, and he began to lay the groundwork for a new kind of kingship, one that was not based on the old, feudal loyalties, but on a more centralised national identity. He was building a new England, one forged in the fires of his own insecurity and the weight of his father's legacy. So, as you recline and let the gentle narrative wash over you, imagine Henry, newly crowned, looking out at a kingdom that is anything but unified. He's surrounded by men who are both his allies and his potential rivals. The air is thick not just with incense but with unspoken questions. Can he rule? Will he be strong enough? The answers to those questions would not be found in the quiet cloisters of a church, but on a muddy battlefield many miles away. The path to Agincourt begins not with a war cry, but with a series of quiet, deliberate decisions made by a young king desperate to secure his place in history. He had to prove to himself and to the world that he was worthy of the crown, that the boy who once brawled in taverns was a man who could lead a nation. And in this moment, you're watching him take the first fateful steps on that journey. You're no longer in the hushed ceremonial space of the abbey. The scene shifts, and you find yourself in the draughty great hall of a medieval castle, the air alive with the low murmur of courtiers and the scent of wood smoke. This is where the real work of kingship is done. Henry V, no longer the solemn figure of his coronation, is a whirlwind of quiet, focused energy. He is consolidating his power, shoring up his weak points, and proving to a sceptical court that his transformation is not a facade. He knows, deep in his bones, that a king with a fractured kingdom is no king at all. His focus is on unity, on turning potential enemies into a single, cohesive force. His first major act, as we touched on before, was a stroke of strategic genius. By reinterring the body of King Richard II, he wasn't just being a good guy, he was performing a powerful piece of political theatre. It was a visual, tangible act of reconciliation. He was saying, in effect, the old feuds are over, the old grudges are gone, I'm a new kind of king, one who rules with justice and peace. This gesture was a masterclass in public relations. It took the sting out of his father's usurpation and gave the new king a fresh slate. It's a bit like a new CEO publicly apologising for the shady practices of his predecessor. The historical fact is that this single act did more to appease the pro-Richard faction of the nobility than years of war ever could. It was a peaceful coup, a quiet victory that paved the way for more significant campaigns to come. But a king's job is never just about optics. Henry had to deal with very real, very present threats. The most pressing was the ongoing Welsh rebellion led by Owain Glyndwr. The rebellion had been a thorn in the side of Henry IV's reign for years, a persistent drain on both resources and morale. Rather than throwing more men and money at it, Henry V took a different approach. He offered pardons to many of the rebels, a surprisingly lenient move for a medieval king. He knew that military victory in the mountainous Welsh terrain was a slow, costly process, and he had bigger plans. By offering a way out, he began to peel away the support for Glyndwr. The rebellion, which had been a fire for a decade, slowly began to smoulder and then, almost imperceptibly, die out. This was a king who was thinking several moves ahead on the political chessboard. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about this period is the surprising clemency Henry showed to his old friend Sir John Falstaff. While the traditional narrative has Henry casting him off in a dramatic scene, the reality is a little more complex. Some accounts suggest that Henry did in fact provide for Falstaff, or at least his family, after he became king. He didn't just abandon his old companions, he ensured they were looked after, albeit from a distance. This small act of personal loyalty, even in the midst of a radical transformation, suggests a man who was capable of both ruthlessness and genuine compassion. It hints at the complex character beneath the royal veneer, a man who is not a simple caricature of a hero, but a deeply human figure with competing loyalties and a difficult past. This brings us back to a scholarly debate that persists to this day. Historians still argue whether Henry's actions were driven by a genuine sense of piety and a desire for justice or by pure, cold-blooded political pragmatism. Was the pardon of the Welsh rebels an act of mercy, or was it a way to free up his army and treasury for his much larger, more ambitious plan? Was the reburial of Richard II a sign of true repentance, or was it a slick PR move designed to smooth the way for his war with France? It's a fascinating question, because the answers reveal two very different kinds of kings. A pious, just king who believes in divine right, or a brilliant Machiavellian ruler who understands that the ends justify the means. The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in the middle, a blend of sincere belief and shrewd political calculation. Henry also had to deal with the Lollards, a religious movement that had grown into a serious threat to both the church and the crown. Their leader, a man named Sir John Oldcastle, was a former friend of Henry's and a powerful figure in his own right. Henry personally tried to persuade Oldcastle to renounce his beliefs, a testament to the king's piety and his desire to avoid bloodshed. When Oldcastle refused and then escaped from the Tower of London, he launched a full-scale rebellion, gathering followers in the very forests where Henry had once caroused. Henry, however, was no longer the boy who ran with rebels. He was a king. He acted swiftly and decisively, crushing the rebellion before it could truly take hold. It was a harsh but necessary lesson for the country. This new king would not tolerate dissent, even from his old friends. The Lollard rebellion, though small, showed that Henry was willing to use force to maintain order, and that his claims of piety were not to be trifled with. As you sit here in your imaginary castle hall, you can almost hear the gears of Henry's mind turning. He's not just putting out fires, he's building a foundation. He's securing alliances with the powerful nobles who were once his father's enemies. He's replenishing his empty treasury through new taxes and by selling off the royal family's less essential trinkets. He's building a unified army, one that's loyal not to a local lord, but to the crown itself. He is, for all intents and purposes, a CEO doing a complete corporate restructuring of an entire kingdom, and he's doing it with a speed and efficiency that is breathtaking. The kingdom, once fractured and teetering on the brink of another civil war, is slowly being knitted back together by the will of a single, determined man. This period of consolidation is crucial because it sets the stage for everything that follows. Without a stable home base, Henry's grand ambitions in France would have been a non-starter. He had to prove to his people that he was a king worth following, a leader who could bring peace and prosperity, not just more bloodshed. The political and social reforms he enacted were not just for show. They were the essential groundwork for a nation on the cusp of an aggressive all-or-nothing war. The wild Prince of Eastcheap has been replaced by a quiet, formidable force, and the Kingdom of England is now his to command. You can feel the change in the air, a sense of purpose and direction that has been missing for a long time. The scattered pieces of the kingdom are being pulled together, and they are all pointed in one very specific direction, across the sea to France. You're no longer in the castle hall. You've moved into the dimly lit, smoke-filled chamber of Henry V's inner council. The map of Europe is spread out on a heavy oak table, and the air is thick with the scent of beeswax and old parchment. The conversation is not about putting down rebellions anymore, but about something far more ambitious and dangerous: France. Henry is not a man to leave things to chance. His claim to the French throne is not a sudden whim, but a carefully constructed, multi-layered argument designed to provide him with both a legal pretext for war and a moral justification. He is playing a game of chess on a grand scale, and every move is designed to put the French king in check. The core of Henry's claim, the historical fact that underpins his entire invasion, rests on a very specific and controversial genealogical argument. He traced his lineage back to Isabella of France, the daughter of King Philip IV and the mother of the deposed King Edward III of England. His argument was, essentially, that the French throne should have passed through the female line, and therefore, as the rightful heir to the Plantagenet line, he had a superior claim to the French throne than the current king, Charles VI. This seems a bit silly to our modern sensibilities, but in the intricate world of medieval dynastic succession, this was a perfectly valid, if shaky, argument. The French, for their part, relied on something called the Salic Law, a medieval legal code that explicitly forbade succession through the female line. It was a classic case of legal versus historical precedent, and neither side was willing to budge. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about this period is the surprising role of the Church in legitimising Henry's claim. Before the invasion, Henry V's agents and scholars travelled to the continent to gather support and, more importantly, to seek clerical approval for his war. They argued that the French, by refusing his claim and by tolerating the schism in the Catholic Church, where there were two rival popes, had forfeited their right to rule. The Church, seeing an opportunity to end the schism and perhaps gain a powerful new ally, was surprisingly receptive. This wasn't just a war of kings. It was a war of divine right, a crusade, in a way. The war was framed not just as a political struggle, but as a righteous act of a pious king. This brings us to a point of scholarly debate that is still a source of fascination. Historians still argue whether Henry V genuinely believed in his claim, or if it was merely a cynical pretext for war. The popular narrative, the one we've all heard, is that he was a man of deep faith who truly believed he was God's chosen instrument to bring order to a chaotic world. His pious nature and his public show of faith support this. But what if it was all a brilliant piece of theatre? What if the claim was a tool, a perfect excuse to wage a war that would unite his own kingdom, fill his coffers, and secure his legacy? It's a compelling thought. A king, after all, needs a reason to go to war, and I want your land and your money isn't as good as God has called upon me to reclaim what is rightfully mine. Henry's negotiations with the French were a masterclass in brinksmanship. He started with a reasonable request, demanding a huge sum of money and the return of territories in Normandy and Aquitaine that had been lost over the years. This was his lowball offer, designed to seem reasonable while also being completely unacceptable to the French. When they refused, as he knew they would, he upped the ante. He then demanded the hand of the French Princess Catherine in marriage, along with an even larger dowry and the formal recognition of his claim to the throne. These demands were so audacious, so insulting, that they were a de facto declaration of war. Henry was not trying to find a peaceful solution. He was systematically constructing a narrative that would make the French look unreasonable, and himself look like a man of peace, forced into war. You can almost feel the tension in the room as the French messengers return with their final insulting reply. The French court, led by a mentally unstable king, was divided by infighting between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions. They saw Henry's demands as a sign of English weakness, not strength. They believed that the English, still recovering from a generation of civil war, would never have the stomach for a large-scale invasion. They were, of course, tragically mistaken. They believed that Henry was a young, untested king, a mere boy playing at war. The French Dauphin, or Crown Prince, was even said to have sent Henry a gift, a box of tennis balls, a cheeky suggestion that he should go back to playing games and leave the serious business of war to men. That famous tennis ball incident, whether a historical fact or a fictional embellishment, perfectly encapsulates the French court's arrogant misreading of Henry V's character. They saw the wild prince, the party boy, not the calculating king. They believed his demands were a bluff. They couldn't have been more wrong. The tennis balls, if they were sent, would have been a public and deeply humiliating slap in the face. It would have provided Henry with a perfect public justification for his war. He could stand before his parliament and his people and say, "Look at their arrogance. They mock us with toys. They refuse to take our righteous claims seriously." The tennis balls were not a gift. They were a declaration. They sealed the fate of thousands of men and set the stage for one of the most famous battles in history. So as you listen, imagine Henry V sitting at that table, his face a mask of quiet determination. He has done the work. He has built the alliances. He has secured the political and moral justification. The long, painstaking work of uniting his kingdom and building his claim is complete. All that remains is the execution. The map of France, once a distant territory, is now a stage for his ambition. The tennis balls, a symbol of ridicule, have been transformed into a symbol of righteous anger. The game of chess is over. The time for talking is done. The time for war is at hand. And you, in this moment, are watching a king on the brink of making a decision that will change the course of history, not just for England and France, but for the very idea of what a king could be. You're no longer in the hushed council chamber. The scene is now a grand reception hall, the air filled with the scent of roasted meat and the boisterous chatter of courtiers. But a sudden, pregnant silence falls over the room. A French delegation, all swagger and silk, has just departed, leaving behind a small box on a table. It's not a peace treaty or a royal gift. It's a box of tennis balls, a child's toy. The message is clear and brutal. King Henry V is not a serious monarch, just a boy who should stick to games. You can feel the collective gasp of the English court, a silent, seething rage. This isn't just an insult, it's a public humiliation. And for a king whose entire reign is built on the fragile foundation of legitimacy, this is an act of war. The historical fact is that the tale of the tennis balls, while perhaps apocryphal in its exact details, perfectly captures the arrogant and condescending attitude of the French court toward the young English king. The French, embroiled in their own civil war between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, viewed England as a minor, unstable power. They believed Henry was a pretender, a boy king with a shaky claim and a bankrupt treasury. Their dismissal of his demands and their open mockery was a profound miscalculation. The insult provided Henry with a perfect public and emotional justification for his war. He could stand before his parliament, his nobility and his people and say, "They mock us. They insult our honour. This is not just a war for a crown, it's a war for our dignity." One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about the lead-up to the war is the surprising amount of clerical support Henry V received from within France itself. The French clergy, fed up with the chaos caused by their divided and unstable monarchy, saw Henry V as a potential unifier and a devoutly pious king. They believed that a strong religious ruler like Henry could bring an end to the schism in the church and restore order to a nation in chaos. It's a bit like a corporate board secretly rooting for a hostile takeover, because they believe the new boss will finally get things done. Henry's piety, which we discussed earlier, was a powerful tool. It was a weapon he wielded just as skillfully as any sword. He wasn't just a king, he was God's chosen instrument, and this made his war not just a political act, but a holy one. This brings us to a point of scholarly debate that is still a source of fascination. Historians still argue whether the French decision to respond with arrogance and mockery was a conscious strategic blunder or simply a symptom of their deep-seated internal divisions and their collective misreading of Henry's character. Did they underestimate him on purpose, hoping to lure him into a costly and ultimately disastrous invasion? Or were they simply so blinded by their own internal power struggles that they couldn't see the storm gathering on the horizon? The French king, Charles VI, was famously known as the Mad King, plagued by bouts of severe mental illness. His court was a snake pit of rivalries, with the two major factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, more interested in killing each other than in preparing for a foreign invasion. The tennis ball incident in this light was less a strategic move and more a tragic symptom of a broken kingdom. The insult and Henry's furious reaction was the final piece of the puzzle. He had united his kingdom, consolidated his power, and built a seemingly legitimate claim to the French throne. All he needed was a moral and emotional casus belli, a public justification that would rally his people to his cause. The tennis balls provided this in spades. Henry, in a famous speech, at least according to later accounts, swore to avenge the insult on the tennis court of France with a very different kind of game. He would smite them with hard iron and show them that he was a man to be reckoned with. The insult became a rallying cry. It was the moment that the long, tedious work of diplomacy and political manoeuvring ended, and the hard, brutal work of war began. The logistical challenge of launching a full-scale invasion of France was staggering. Henry needed not just men, but ships, supplies, money, and a network of alliances. He had been quietly building his war machine for months, but the tennis balls gave him the final push he needed to go public. He began to tax his people heavily, raise a professional army, and charter or seize ships from every port in England. The sheer scale of the undertaking was immense. A medieval army wasn't just a group of soldiers. It was a small, mobile city with armourers, blacksmiths, cooks, and a constant need for food, water, and forage. And this was all on top of the monumental task of transporting thousands of men, their horses, and all their equipment across the unpredictable and often treacherous English Channel. You can almost hear the bustle and clamour of a nation preparing for war. Shipyards are working around the clock. Blacksmiths are forging thousands of arrowheads. Soldiers are drilling in fields, their shouts echoing across the countryside. Henry is everywhere at once, a man possessed by a singular purpose. He's no longer the wild boy of Eastcheap. He's the quiet, formidable king we saw in the council chamber, now fully in command of his destiny. He has turned a childish insult into a declaration of national purpose. He has taken the French's weakness, their arrogance and their internal divisions, and used it as a lever to pry open the door to a full-scale invasion. This moment, the catalyst of the tennis balls, is a perfect microcosm of Henry V's reign. He was a master of turning weakness into strength, insult into motivation, and political necessity into moral justification. The French may have thought they were sending him a toy, but what they were really doing was handing him a key to unlocking the full fury of his ambition, to unleashing the power of a unified England, and to embarking on a path that would lead him to one of the most famous and improbable victories in all of military history. And so, the die is cast, the game is over, the war is on, and you, in this moment, are watching a kingdom prepare for a journey into the unknown, a journey that will either lead to glorious triumph or total, catastrophic defeat. You're no longer watching from the safety of a courtly hall. The scene is now the bustling, chaotic port of Southampton in the spring of 1415. The air is filled with the cry of gulls, the smell of salt and tar, and the rhythmic sound of hammers on wood. You're walking among thousands of men, knights, archers, and foot soldiers, all preparing for the great invasion. The logistical nightmare of getting an entire army across the Channel is now a harsh, tangible reality. The French may have sent tennis balls, but Henry V is about to send them an army of iron and steel, and the sheer scale of the operation is breathtaking. The historical fact is that the invasion of France in 1415 was one of the largest logistical undertakings in medieval history. Henry V raised an army of approximately 10,000 to 12,000 men, a massive force for the time. This wasn't just a simple matter of gathering men. He had to feed, arm, and transport every single one of them. The sheer volume of supplies was staggering. Tons of flour, barrels of ale, salted meat, and a countless number of bows, arrows, and suits of armour. To move all of this, he needed a fleet. Henry's administration, known for its efficiency, commissioned or commandeered over 1,500 ships from ports all over England and as far away as Spain and Holland. These ships were a motley crew of cogs, barges, and even smaller fishing vessels, all pressed into the service of a king with a single overriding purpose. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about this massive operation is the meticulousness with which Henry's government managed the finances. The war wasn't cheap. The crown was effectively broke, a legacy of Henry IV's expensive reign. To fund the invasion, Henry V's administration used a variety of creative financial measures. They took out enormous loans from the wealthy merchants of London and Florence, using the crown jewels as collateral. They levied heavy taxes on the populace, and even had nobles and churchmen contribute to the war effort. The financial records of this period are a testament to Henry's administrative genius. You can find detailed receipts for everything from a handful of arrows to a loan from a Florentine banker. It's a bit like planning a massive multi-billion-dollar expedition today, but with quills and parchment instead of spreadsheets. This leads us to a point of scholarly debate that still fuels historical arguments. Historians still argue whether Henry V's invasion was a brilliant calculated gamble or a reckless, desperate play by a king who had no other choice. Was he truly a strategic genius who saw an opportunity in the chaos of France? Or was he a king who had to find an external conflict to distract from his internal problems? The logistical challenge alone was so immense that any small misstep could have led to a catastrophic failure. A storm could have wiped out his fleet. A sickness could have decimated his army before they even left English soil. Henry was betting his entire kingdom and his very life on the success of this invasion. It was a high-stakes poker game where the chips were the lives of thousands of men. The preparation wasn't just about logistics, it was also about morale. Henry V was a deeply pious man, and he used his faith as a powerful tool. He commissioned prayers and sermons throughout the kingdom, framing the war as a righteous crusade. He preached a message of unity and divine purpose, telling his men that they were not just soldiers, but instruments of God's will. This religious fervour was a potent force. It transformed the raw, often reluctant recruits into a cohesive force bound by a common belief. It gave them a sense of purpose that went beyond just money or loyalty to a local lord. They were fighting for God, for England, and for their righteous king. As you walk through the crowded port, you can see Henry himself, a quiet, commanding presence moving among his men. He's inspecting the ships, checking on the provisions and speaking to his soldiers. He's not the aloof, distant monarch of legend, but a king who understands that his success depends on the loyalty and morale of the men he is leading. He is, to put it simply, a brilliant leader of men. He knows their needs, understands their fears, and can inspire them with a word or a look. He's not just a king, he's a general, and he is preparing his army for a journey into the heart of enemy territory. The final days before the invasion were a frenzy of activity. The ships were loaded with men, horses, weapons, and supplies. The wind was a key factor. They had to wait for the right weather to cross the channel. The French, for their part, were watching from the other side, but they were still underestimating Henry. They believed the invasion was a bluff, a piece of political theatre. They were convinced that the English would never dare to cross in such numbers. The French king's court, still a mess of infighting and indecision, was slow to react, a fatal error that Henry V had been banking on all along. And so, as the sun sets over the port of Southampton, the fleet stands ready. It is an act of faith and defiance. It is the culmination of years of planning, of political manoeuvring, and of sheer will. The wild Prince of Eastcheap has become a king with a righteous cause, an army, and a fleet. He has turned his country's weakness into a surprising strength, and he is about to unleash it upon his enemies. The die is cast, the ships are ready to sail, and you in this moment are watching a kingdom embark on a journey that will either lead to glorious triumph or total, catastrophic defeat. The stage is set for one of the most famous and improbable military campaigns in history. The sea journey is over, and you find yourself standing on the shore of France, not with the triumphant feeling of an invading conqueror, but with a sense of grim foreboding. The fleet has landed near the port town of Harfleur, a vital strategic target at the mouth of the Seine. The English army disembarks, a massive, muddy and tired force. The roar of the waves is replaced by the distant shouts of commanders and the clamour of men setting up camp. This is it. The tennis balls, the negotiations, the insults, they all led to this moment. The first gruesome test of Henry's leadership is about to begin. The historical fact is that the siege of Harfleur was a brutal, drawn-out affair that took a heavy toll on Henry's army. The siege began on August 18th, 1415, and the English army, with their primitive cannons and siege engines, had to contend with a well-fortified town and a determined garrison. The French defenders, under the command of the Lord of Gaucourt, were not about to surrender without a fight. The siege was a contest of attrition, a slow and agonizing battle against not just the enemy, but against time, disease, and the constant threat of a French relief army. This was not the quick, decisive victory Henry had likely hoped for. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about the siege is the surprisingly sophisticated use of medieval siege technology. The English army brought with them large cannons known as bombards that could fire stone cannonballs at the town's walls. These were not the sleek, powerful cannons of a later age. They were clumsy, temperamental devices that often exploded, but they represented the cutting edge of military technology at the time. Henry V's army also used siege towers and sappers to undermine the walls, a testament to the methodical and professional nature of his force. It was a brutal game of chess, where the moves were measured in broken stone and shattered lives. This brings us to a point of scholarly debate that is still a source of historical fascination. Historians still argue whether Henry V's relentless insistence on taking Harfleur was a strategic necessity or a grave strategic error. Was it a vital foothold, a secure port from which to launch the rest of his campaign? Or was it an unnecessary detour, a bloody and costly siege that weakened his army and delayed his advance? The siege lasted for 5 weeks, a long and agonising time for an army that was already low on morale and supplies. The longer the siege went on, the greater the risk that a French relief army would arrive and crush the English force against the walls of the town. The siege was not just a battle against the French, it was a battle against disease. The unsanitary conditions, the close quarters, and the lack of fresh water in the English camp led to a widespread outbreak of dysentery, a horrific disease that left men weak, dehydrated, and unable to fight. It was a silent, insidious enemy that claimed more lives than the French archers ever could. The army that had landed with over 10,000 men was, by the end of the siege, a mere shadow of its former self, its ranks thinned by sickness and death. It's a bit like a modern military operation where a computer virus cripples the entire network. The enemy you can see is not the one you should fear. You can almost feel the grinding misery of the English soldiers. They are not the glorious heroes of later legend. They are tired, sick, and demoralised men. They are caked in mud and dust, their faces hollow with exhaustion. The constant shelling and the cries of the wounded and the dying create a grim, unending soundtrack. Henry V, for his part, is not immune to the suffering. He is constantly on the move, encouraging his men, overseeing the siege, and dealing with the logistical nightmare of a sick and starving army. He is a king who leads from the front, a stark contrast to many of the French commanders who are still bickering and fighting among themselves, unable to muster a unified response. The French, for their part, believed that the siege was a testament to the English weakness. They were convinced that Henry would be forced to retreat, his army decimated by disease and his plans in tatters. They refused to send a relief army, believing that time was on their side. This was another catastrophic miscalculation. They failed to understand the quiet, grim determination of the English king. Henry V was not a man to give up. He had gambled his entire kingdom on this invasion, and he was not about to lose the first hand. Finally, on September 22nd, the French garrison, exhausted and low on supplies, surrendered. Henry's victory was a costly one, and it left him with a difficult choice. His army was too small and too sick to continue the campaign. He had to decide whether to retreat back to England or to risk a long, dangerous march to the English-held town of Calais. He chose the latter. It was a bold, some would say foolhardy decision, but Henry was a man who understood the importance of momentum and the power of perception. To retreat back to England would be seen as a sign of weakness, an admission of defeat. To march to Calais, even with a depleted and sick army, would be a sign of strength, a defiant gesture that said, "I came to France to win, and I'm not leaving until I'm ready." And so, as the gates of Harfleur open and the English army marches in, you can see the weary, relieved faces of the soldiers, but their relief is short-lived. The hard-won victory has come at a great cost, and the journey ahead is even more perilous. They have conquered a city, but they have yet to face a French army. The stage is set for a long, gruelling march that will push the English army to its absolute breaking point and lead to one of the most famous confrontations in all of military history. The gruesome first test is over, but the real challenge has just begun. The gates of Harfleur slam shut behind you, not with the sound of triumph, but with a weary finality. The victorious army, now a sick and battered force, turns inland, not toward the triumphant return to England, but toward a long, gruelling march to Calais. You're no longer a conquering hero, you're a foot soldier in a starving, dying column, trudging through the relentless rain and mud of the French countryside. This is the march of death, a retreat disguised as a defiant advance, and it will push Henry V and his men to their absolute breaking point. The historical fact is that Henry's decision to march to Calais was a high-risk gamble. He had to cross nearly 150 miles of hostile territory with an army decimated by dysentery and battle. His forces had been reduced from over 10,000 to perhaps 5,000 effectives. The French, for their part, had finally begun to stir. The divided factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, put aside their differences just long enough to gather a massive army. They believed they had the English trapped. They didn't need to fight. They just had to wait, to dog the English column, and to let sickness and starvation do their work. They were right to a point. The English army was suffering horribly. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about this march is the sheer ingenuity of the French peasants. They weren't just passive observers. They harassed the English column mercilessly, stealing supplies, ambushing stragglers, and poisoning wells. To the English soldiers, the entire countryside seemed to be alive with a silent, invisible enemy. They were constantly on guard, constantly under threat, and their supplies were dwindling by the day. It's a bit like a zombie apocalypse, where every house and every forest hides a potential threat. The English army wasn't just marching, it was surviving. This brings us to a point of scholarly debate that is still hotly debated. Historians still argue whether Henry V's march was an act of reckless arrogance or a brilliant strategic feint. Did he know he would be intercepted? Was he actively trying to lure the French into a confrontation on his terms? Or was he truly just trying to get to the safety of Calais, a desperate man with a failing plan? The popular narrative, of course, is that he was a genius who knew exactly what he was doing, but the reality on the ground was far more grim. His men were sick and starving. The French army, over 3 times the size of his own, was closing in. The odds were so impossibly stacked against him that it's difficult to see it as anything but an act of desperation. The march itself was a study in human misery. The English soldiers, many of them suffering from dysentery, had to march for days in a relentless rain, their heavy armour caked in mud. They were running out of food, and their morale was at an all-time low. Henry V, for his part, was a quiet, constant presence among them. He was not a king who rode in a comfortable carriage. He was on foot with his men, sharing their hardships, and encouraging them with a quiet determination. He was a king who led by example, and this earned him a deep personal loyalty from his soldiers. They might have been miserable, but they still believed in their king. Finally, on October 24th, the English army, exhausted and on the brink of collapse, reached the Somme River. They needed to cross it to get to Calais, but the French had destroyed all the bridges and were waiting for them. The English were trapped. They were surrounded by a massive French army and were pinned against a river they could not cross. It was, to all accounts, the end of the line. The French army, over 20,000 strong, was waiting for them on the other side. The English, with their sick and starving army, had nowhere left to run. But Henry, ever the strategist, did something unexpected. He didn't despair. Instead, he led his army on a desperate last-ditch search for a ford. Miraculously, they found one, an obscure crossing that was undefended. It was a moment of sheer luck, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. The English army, weak and exhausted, crossed the river and were finally free of the immediate French trap. But their relief was short-lived. The French army, in a brilliant move of their own, had anticipated this and had raced ahead, blocking their path to Calais. The two armies were now on a collision course, and a battle was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The stage was set. The English army, battered and demoralised, was trapped between the French army and the sea. The French, for their part, were supremely confident. They had the numbers, the fresh troops, and the home field advantage. They believed that this would be a simple mop-up operation, a chance to end the English invasion once and for all. They failed to understand that the English, pushed to the very brink of despair, had nothing left to lose. They had already faced down disease and starvation. They had survived a brutal march through hostile territory. They were no longer just an army. They were a band of brothers, a single, unbreakable force united by a shared sense of misery, and a quiet, formidable king who had led them this far. And so, as the day draws to a close, you find yourself on a muddy, rain-soaked field, with the English army on one side and the massive French army on the other. The two sides are separated by a long empty field, a silent, muddy stage set for one of the most famous and improbable battles in history. The march is over. The suffering has reached its climax. All that's left is the fight. The long, gruelling march is over. You're standing in a quiet, muddy field, not as a soldier, but as a silent observer. The day has faded into a chilly, oppressive night, and the air is thick with a chilling mix of rain, mud, and dread. The English army, no more than 6,000 strong, is huddled on one side of a long, narrow field. On the other side, a mere 1,000 yards away, lies the massive, sprawling French army, at least 25,000 men strong. The difference in numbers is terrifying, and the silence is even more so. This isn't the quiet of a peaceful countryside, it's the ominous silence that precedes a storm. This is the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, and you can almost feel the weight of history pressing down on the muddy ground. The historical fact is that the night before the battle was a study in contrasts. The French, supremely confident in their numbers and their superiority, were a noisy, boisterous lot. They were camped in a massive, sprawling mess, their tents lit by roaring fires. They spent the night feasting, drinking and playing dice, their drunken laughter carrying on the wind to the English lines. They believed the battle was a foregone conclusion. They were so confident that many of the French nobles had already begun to argue about who would get to capture Henry V for ransom. It's a bit like a sports team celebrating a championship before the game has even started. They were arrogant, undisciplined, and completely underestimating their opponent. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about this night is the legend of the Nightingale of the Field. According to some accounts, Henry V, disguised as a common soldier, walked among his men, listening to their conversations and offering words of encouragement. This might be a romanticised tale, but it speaks to the very real psychological battle he was fighting. He knew his men were terrified. He knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. His job was not just to lead them into battle, but to give them hope, to convince them that they had a fighting chance. It's a testament to his leadership that, even in the face of impossible odds, his men did not abandon him. This brings us to a point of scholarly debate that still fascinates military historians. Historians still argue whether Henry's decision to position his army on a narrow, muddy field was a masterstroke of strategic genius, or a desperate last-ditch effort by a man with nowhere else to go. The popular narrative, of course, is that he chose the field on purpose, that he understood the terrain was his greatest ally. The muddy, recently ploughed fields, hemmed in by dense forests on either side, would negate the French cavalry's numerical advantage. The French, burdened by their heavy armour, would be forced to march through the mud, becoming easy targets for the English longbowmen. But what if it was just a coincidence? What if he was simply trying to get to Calais and was cornered by the French in a less than ideal location? The fact that the battle was fought there is not in question, but the intentionality behind the choice is still up for debate. While the French were carousing, the English were praying. There was a sombre, religious mood in the English camp. Soldiers spent the night confessing their sins and preparing for death. The king himself, a man of deep piety, spent the night in prayer and contemplation. He had ordered his men to maintain absolute silence, a stark contrast to the boisterous French. This quiet, disciplined force, bound by a shared sense of impending doom and a common purpose, was a far more formidable foe than the French realised. They were not just an army, they were a community, and they were preparing to face their final judgment together. The English archers, the heart and soul of Henry's army, spent the night sharpening their stakes. These were 6-foot-long pointed stakes that they would drive into the ground in front of their positions. These stakes would serve as a makeshift barrier against the French cavalry. It was a simple, yet brilliant defensive measure, a testament to the quiet, methodical planning that was happening in the English camp while the French were still celebrating. These archers were not nobles or knights. They were common men, yeomen from the English countryside, and they were about to prove that a man with a bow and a single-minded purpose could defeat a knight in shining armour. As you stand there in the rain, you can almost hear the quiet, anxious breathing of the English soldiers. There is no bravado, no drunken laughter. There is just a grim, quiet determination. They have marched for days, they have faced down disease and starvation, and now they are about to face an enemy that outnumbers them 5-1. The odds are impossibly stacked against them, but they have one thing the French do not: a leader who they trust, a king who they believe in, and a shared sense of purpose that has been forged in the fires of their shared suffering. The first rays of dawn finally pierce the grey, misty sky. The long, silent night is over. The moment of truth has arrived. The French, still a little bleary-eyed from their night of feasting, begin to form their ranks. They are a magnificent sight, a sea of shining armour and colourful banners. The English, by contrast, are a humble, mud-caked and exhausted force, their banners tattered and their armour dull. The stage is set for a battle that will not be fought by numbers or by bravado, but by grit, determination, and a quiet, unassuming king who had gambled his entire kingdom on a single, impossible battle. The night of ominous silence is over. The long, bloody day is about to begin. The sun, a pale, anemic orb, finally rises over the muddy field. You're standing with the English army, and the tension is so thick you could cut it with a knife. On one side, the English, a small, tired and sickly force, their numbers somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 men. On the other, the French, a vast, seemingly endless sea of shining armour and fluttering banners, their numbers at least 25,000 strong. The stage is set. This is not a battle of equals. This is a battle for survival. And you, a silent observer, are about to witness one of the most improbable victories in all of military history. The historical fact is that the Battle of Agincourt, fought on October 25, 1415, was a masterpiece of military strategy and a testament to the power of the longbow. Henry V, in a brilliant move, had positioned his army on a narrow, recently ploughed field hemmed in by dense forests. The ground was a quagmire turned into a thick, sucking mud by the relentless rain. This terrain, which seemed like a disadvantage, was in fact his greatest ally. It negated the French cavalry's overwhelming numerical superiority. Their heavy horses and even heavier armour would be no match for the thick, sucking mud. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about the battle is the sheer weight of the French knights' armour. The armour of a French man-at-arms could weigh over 60 pounds, and their horses' armour could weigh even more. This was perfect for a swift, decisive cavalry charge on dry ground, but in the thick mud of Agincourt it was a death sentence. The French knights, weighed down by their armour, could barely move, and their horses were constantly slipping and sinking. It's a bit like trying to run a race in a deep swamp while wearing a lead suit. The French were, in effect, fighting the terrain just as much as they were fighting the English. This brings us to a point of scholarly debate that still rages among historians. Historians still argue whether Henry V's decision to use a small, tightly packed force was an act of desperation or a deliberate tactical choice. The popular narrative is that he knew the narrow field would force the French to funnel into a small, concentrated mass, making them perfect targets for his archers. But what if it was just a coincidence? What if he was simply trying to survive, and the tight formation was a natural defensive posture for a small, outnumbered army? Whatever the reason, it was a brilliant move. The French, confident in their numbers, formed 3 massive, unwieldy lines, and began their slow, agonising march toward the English. The battle began with the English longbowmen. Henry had positioned them in a clever wedge-like formation, with the archers on the flanks and the knights in the centre. As the French began their slow, plodding advance, the English archers unleashed a storm of arrows. The sound, according to later accounts, was like a great storm, a constant, terrifying hiss of death. The arrows rained down on the French, a hail of sharpened steel that pierced their armour, struck their horses, and wreaked havoc on their ranks. The French knights, unable to charge and bogged down by the mud, were reduced to stationary targets. Their arrogance had led them to this muddy, nightmarish trap. The first French line, a mix of knights and men-at-arms, finally reached the English lines, but they were exhausted, covered in mud, and had already suffered heavy casualties from the English arrows. The close-quarters fighting was a brutal, bloody mess. The English, with their light armour and nimble swords, were able to exploit the Frenchmen's weakness. The French, on the other hand, were a lumbering, clumsy force. The mud, their armour, and the sheer number of men in a small space turned the battlefield into a meat grinder. The English knights, led by Henry V himself, fought with a grim, quiet determination. The French, in a fit of overconfidence, sent in a second line of men, but they were met with the same fate. They were forced to march over the bodies of their fallen comrades and into the same muddy trap. The slaughter was immense. The third French line, a reserve force, seeing the carnage, began to retreat. The battle, which should have been a French walkover, was a total catastrophic defeat. The French had lost thousands of men, including some of their most powerful nobles. The English, by contrast, had lost a few hundred. It was a victory so total, so absolute, that it seemed to defy all logic. You can almost feel the shocked disbelief on the faces of the English soldiers as the battle ends. They had prepared for death, and they had been given a miracle. They had not just won, they had annihilated the flower of French knighthood. The mud, the terrain, and Henry's quiet, formidable leadership had turned a certain defeat into a glorious victory. The legend of the longbow and the legend of Henry V were born on that muddy field. It was a battle that not only changed the course of the war, but changed the very way medieval warfare was fought. It was a victory for the common man, for the humble English archer, and a profound and humiliating defeat for the heavily armoured aristocratic French. The tennis balls had been avenged, and the French had learned a very hard and very bloody lesson. The last echoes of the battle have faded, and you're standing on the field of Agincourt, not in the triumphant aftermath of a glorious victory, but in the gruesome, grim reality of its consequences. The mud, once a treacherous quagmire, is now a silent, blood-soaked graveyard. The English, in a state of stunned relief and exhaustion, are now faced with the grim task of dealing with their victory. The moment of triumph is over. Now, the quiet, formidable king must make a series of brutal and deeply controversial decisions. The historical fact is that the immediate aftermath of the battle was a scene of utter carnage. The English had taken thousands of French prisoners, many of them high-ranking nobles who were worth a fortune in ransom. But a new threat had emerged. A small group of French skirmishers, a desperate last-ditch effort, had launched an attack on the English baggage train, the non-combatant civilians and supplies behind the main line. Henry V, fearing that the vast number of prisoners would rise up and join the attack, made a horrific and deeply controversial decision. He ordered the prisoners to be executed. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about this period is the very real fear of the English soldiers that they would be overwhelmed by their own prisoners. The English army was still outnumbered, and they were exhausted from the battle. The French knights, for their part, were a proud and vengeful bunch. They had been humiliated and defeated, and the thought of them rising up, taking the English from behind, was a very real and terrifying possibility. The order to kill the prisoners, to a modern mind, seems like a barbaric act. But in the context of the battlefield, with the English army on the brink of collapse, it was seen as a brutal but necessary act of self-preservation. It's a bit like a captain of a sinking ship jettisoning half the cargo to save the rest. It's not a good choice, but it's the only one you have. This leads us to a point of scholarly debate that still rages among historians. Historians still argue whether Henry V's decision to execute the prisoners was an act of cold-blooded cruelty, or a grim necessity forced upon him by the circumstances. The traditional narrative, of course, is that he was a pious and just king who was forced to make an impossible choice. But what if it was an act of brutal, calculated efficiency? Henry V knew that he couldn't afford to keep thousands of prisoners. They would slow him down, consume his limited supplies, and pose a constant threat. The decision to execute them, while morally reprehensible, was a militarily sound one. It was a clear-eyed choice between his army's survival and a code of chivalry that had already proven to be a dangerous anachronism. The execution was carried out with a grim, chilling efficiency. The English archers, the very men who had won the battle, were ordered to carry out the deed. They were not knights, and they had no romantic notions of chivalry. They simply did what their king told them to do. It was a grim, brutal affair, a bloody footnote to a glorious victory. The vast majority of the French nobles were spared, of course. They were the ones who could pay a huge ransom. It was the common French soldier, the one who had no value in the medieval economy, who paid the ultimate price. The aftermath of the battle was also a stark reminder of the realities of medieval warfare. The English, for their part, were in a state of exhaustion and shock. They had not just won a battle, they had survived a slaughter. The French, by contrast, were in a state of utter disbelief. They had lost thousands of men, including some of their most powerful and influential nobles. The entire French military leadership had been decapitated. It was a loss so profound that it would take them years to recover. The Battle of Agincourt was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological and political one. The myth of French invincibility had been shattered in a single day, on a single muddy field. Henry, for his part, was a king in a moral maze. He had won the battle, but at what cost? He had ordered the execution of thousands of men. His army was still sick and exhausted, and he was still a long, dangerous march from the safety of Calais. He was no longer just the pious king from Westminster Abbey. He was a man who had made a choice between his own survival and a code of conduct he had sworn to uphold. The victory, while glorious, was tainted by the blood on his hands. He was no longer a king who was fighting for a righteous cause. He was a man who had committed an act of supreme brutality. And so, as the sun sets over the muddy field of Agincourt, the English army, with their tattered banners and their heavy hearts, begins its long, quiet march to Calais. They are no longer a band of brothers, a group of men who have survived an impossible battle. They are an army, a machine of war led by a quiet, formidable king who has proven that he is willing to do whatever it takes to win. The glory of Agincourt is now a memory, a story to be told and retold. But the reality of the aftermath, the brutal, chilling reality of a king's choice, is a lesson that will linger far longer. The warrior king had won his battle, but he had lost a piece of his soul. The long, gruelling march to Calais is over. The English army, no longer an army of sick and starving men, is now a triumphant force. The French have been utterly defeated, and the English have secured a safe passage home. But the Battle of Agincourt was not an end in itself. It was a means to an end. The real work of conquest, the slow, methodical process of securing the English claim to the French throne, is now about to begin. You're no longer on a muddy battlefield. You're on the high seas, crossing the Channel once more, this time not as a desperate, cornered force, but as a victorious king and his army, returning to a hero's welcome. The historical fact is that Henry V's return to London was a spectacular, triumphant affair. He was met at Dover by cheering crowds, and his procession through the streets of London was a massive city-wide celebration. He was no longer the wild prince. He was the conqueror of Agincourt, the hero king. He had not just won a battle. He had restored England's pride and proven to himself and to the world that his family had a God-given right to rule. The tennis balls had been avenged, the insult had been repaid, and the king was a hero. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about this period is the surprising resilience of the French. Despite the catastrophic defeat at Agincourt, they were not defeated. The French crown was still intact, and the two major factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, were still fighting each other. This internal strife, more than any English military might, was Henry's greatest ally. He understood that he didn't need to defeat the French in a single battle. He just needed to keep them fighting among themselves while he slowly, methodically and relentlessly conquered their territory. It's a bit like two opponents in a boxing match punching each other so hard that they can't even see the third guy who is sneaking up behind them. This leads us to a point of scholarly debate that still rages among historians. Historians still argue whether Henry V's long-term plan was to conquer all of France, or to simply secure the territories he believed were rightfully his, particularly Normandy. The traditional narrative, of course, is that he was a man of boundless ambition who wanted nothing less than the French crown. But what if his plan was far more pragmatic? What if he was simply trying to restore the Plantagenet Empire, to reclaim the lands that had been lost by his predecessors? The conquest of France was a long, slow and expensive process. Perhaps Henry's ambition, while great, was also tempered by the harsh realities of medieval warfare and finance. Henry's second invasion of France in 1417 was a far different affair than his first. This was not a quick, lightning strike invasion. This was a slow, methodical campaign of conquest. He brought with him a professional, disciplined army, and he began a systematic campaign to conquer and secure the entire Duchy of Normandy. He didn't just win battles, he conquered and held territory. He used a combination of sieges, small skirmishes, and a brutal efficiency that was a hallmark of his reign. He had learned his lesson from the siege of Harfleur. This time, he was not in a hurry. He had all the time in the world and he was going to take it. The siege of Rouen, the capital of Normandy, was a particularly brutal and defining moment of this campaign. The siege lasted for 6 long months, and it was a study in grim, patient endurance. The French garrison and the civilians were starved into submission. The siege was so desperate that the French tried to expel all of the non-combatants, but Henry refused to let them pass, trapping them in a no-man's land between the city walls and the English camp, where many of them starved to death. It was a cold, brutal decision, but it was effective. It was a clear signal to the French that Henry V was not a king to be trifled with. You can almost feel the grinding misery of the French people as the English army slowly, inexorably conquered their land. Henry V was not a marauding tyrant. He was a disciplined, methodical ruler. He established a professional administration in the conquered territories, a system of law and order that was, in many ways, more efficient than the chaos of the French court. He was building an empire, not just a series of military outposts. He was a king who understood that a conquest was not just about winning a battle, it was about winning the peace. The French, meanwhile, were still mired in their internal conflicts. The Armagnac and Burgundian factions were so consumed by their hatred for each other that they were unable to present a unified front. The assassination of the Duke of Burgundy, a man who had once been an ally of Henry, threw the French court into a state of utter chaos. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, was so enraged by the act that he allied himself with the English. It was a shocking turn of events, and it was the final, fatal blow to the French cause. They were no longer fighting one enemy, they were fighting two. And so, as the years go on, Henry V continues his slow, patient conquest. He has secured a firm foothold in France, he has a powerful ally in the Duke of Burgundy, and he has a French court that is still in a state of utter collapse. The wild Prince of Eastcheap, the conqueror of Agincourt, is now the de facto ruler of a large part of France. The impossible dream is no longer a dream, it is a reality. And you, in this moment, are watching a king build an empire brick by bloody brick on the long hard road of conquest and political manoeuvring. The stage is set for a final, surprising act, a royal courtship and a treaty that will change the course of history forever. You've left the bloody fields of Normandy and the grim sieges of its towns. The scene has shifted not to another battlefield, but to a temporary court in the French countryside. The air is no longer thick with the smell of blood and mud, but with the delicate scent of perfume and the nervous tension of diplomacy. Henry V, the fearsome warrior king, is about to embark on a campaign of a different kind, a royal courtship. His target is not a city, but a woman, Catherine of Valois, the French princess. This is a political manoeuvre disguised as a romance, a final act of conquest to secure his legacy, and you are a silent, fascinated observer. The historical fact is that the courtship between Henry and Catherine was not a love story in the modern sense. It was a cold, calculated negotiation. Henry had been demanding Catherine's hand in marriage for years, but it was not for love. It was a core part of his claim to the French throne. Marrying the French king's daughter would not just unite the two houses, it would in effect make him a member of the French royal family. He would be the rightful heir, not just by a tenuous genealogical claim, but by blood and marriage. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about this period is the surprising resilience of the French queen, Isabeau of Bavaria. Her husband, King Charles VI, was famously known as the Mad King, and his mental illness had plunged the court into a state of chaos. But Queen Isabeau, in a moment of political savvy, took control of the negotiations. She was not a simple, decorative queen. She was a ruthless, pragmatic ruler in her own right, and she was the one who was truly a match for Henry V's cunning. She understood that a marriage between Catherine and Henry was the only way to save what was left of her kingdom, and she was willing to make a deal with the devil. This brings us to a point of scholarly debate that still fascinates historians. Historians still argue whether Catherine of Valois was a helpless pawn in a political game, or a woman who understood her role and accepted her fate with a quiet, steely resolve. The popular narrative, of course, is that she was a passive victim, a princess whose life was dictated by the men around her. But what if she was an active participant? She was a woman of intelligence and wit, and she would have understood that her marriage was the only hope for a lasting peace between the two nations. She was not just a symbol of the alliance, she was a living, breathing part of it. The survival of her family and her people depended on her, and she carried that burden with a quiet dignity. The courtship itself was a strange, formal affair. Henry V and Catherine were, to put it mildly, not a match made in heaven. She was a beautiful, refined French princess. He was a battle-hardened English king who had spent most of his life on the battlefield. Their conversations were a mix of stilted formality and nervous glances. Henry, despite his lack of courtly grace, was a man who knew what he wanted, and he was a persistent, if awkward, suitor. The courtship was a game of political poker, with each side trying to get the best deal, but there was a flicker of something more. Henry, for all his cold pragmatism, was a man who appreciated beauty and grace. Catherine, for all her quiet resignation, was a woman who could not help but be intrigued by the man who had conquered her country. You can almost feel the tension in the room as the negotiations drag on. The French are trying to hold on to as much as they can. Henry is trying to get as much as he can. The stakes are impossibly high. The French Dauphin or Crown Prince is still a thorn in Henry's side, and the Dauphin's agents are still trying to undermine the peace process. But Henry has the upper hand. He has the military might, he has the Duke of Burgundy on his side, and he has a French court that is desperate for an end to the long, brutal war. The final deal was a testament to Henry's ruthless efficiency. He demanded not just the hand of Catherine, but the formal recognition of his claim to the French throne. He wanted to be the heir to the French crown, not just a usurper who had married a princess. It was an audacious demand, a final, stunning act of political extortion. But the French, with their country in ruins and their court in chaos, had no other choice. They had to agree. The Treaty of Troyes was not a peace treaty, it was a surrender. And so, in a moment of triumph, Henry V, the conqueror of Agincourt, the king who had once been a wild, brawling prince, sealed his destiny. He would be king of England, and he would one day be king of France. He had not just won a battle, he had won an entire kingdom. He had not just married a princess, he had married a dynasty. The unlikely romance, born out of political necessity, was a final brilliant act of a man who understood that power was not just about the sword, but about the pen. The wedding of Henry V and Catherine of Valois was a grand, spectacular affair, a celebration of the end of a long, brutal war and the beginning of a new era. The two nations were now, at least in theory, one. Henry was no longer just the King of England. He was the heir to the French crown, and his son, if he had one, would one day be king of both nations. The impossible dream, the one that had been laughed at with tennis balls, was now a reality. The warrior king had finally won. But the peace he had forged was a fragile one, and the road ahead would be far more difficult than he could ever have imagined. The king had won his crown, but he had yet to win the hearts of the French people, and the Dauphin, the true heir, was still a threat. The story of Henry V's reign is not a simple fairy tale. It's a complex, brutal, and utterly fascinating story of a man who was willing to do whatever it took to win. The wedding celebrations are over, the toasts have been made, the feast consumed, and the royal couple, Henry and Catherine, have been joined in a union that is both a marriage and a political act. But the real meat of the matter lies in the parchment they have just signed, the Treaty of Troyes. You're no longer a wedding guest. You're a witness to a moment that will change the course of English and French history forever. A silent observer to the most audacious and consequential piece of diplomacy in the medieval age. Henry V has not just won a battle, he has won a kingdom, and the French have, for all intents and purposes, surrendered their sovereignty. The historical fact is that the Treaty of Troyes, signed on May 21st, 1420, was a landmark document that was a direct result of the chaos and desperation of the French court. The treaty had three major provisions. First, it disinherited the French Dauphin, or Crown Prince Charles, effectively making him an outcast and a traitor. Second, it recognised Henry V as the regent of France and the heir to the French throne. And third, it formally sanctioned the marriage of Henry V and Catherine of Valois, thereby uniting the two royal houses and giving Henry a legitimate claim to the throne through a direct bloodline. It was a complete capitulation, a legal document that handed over an entire kingdom on a silver platter. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about the treaty is the fact that it was signed in a French town, Troyes, but it was largely negotiated in English. The French court, in its state of chaos and disarray, had to rely on translators to communicate with the English. It's a small detail, but it speaks volumes about the imbalance of power between the two nations. The French, for all their pride and their history, were now a defeated and fragmented people, forced to negotiate in the language of their conqueror. It was a final, quiet humiliation, a testament to how far they had fallen. This leads us to a point of scholarly debate that still rages among historians. Historians still argue whether the Treaty of Troyes was a legitimate agreement or a desperate act by a broken kingdom. Was it a valid legal document that disinherited a rightful heir? Or was it a piece of political theatre, a document that had no real force of law and was simply a way for the French queen, Isabeau, to save her family and her kingdom from total ruin? The Dauphin, for his part, certainly believed the latter. He refused to recognise the treaty and set up a rival court in southern France, a pocket of resistance that would plague the English for years to come. The treaty, while a legal masterpiece, was a double-edged sword. It gave Henry a claim to the French throne, but it also created a new enemy, a legitimate heir who refused to go away. Henry, for his part, was in a state of quiet triumph. He had achieved the impossible. He was now, in effect, the heir to the French throne. But he was not a man to rest on his laurels. He understood that a treaty was just a piece of paper. The real work of ruling and conquering was still ahead of him. He had a kingdom to govern, a people to win over, and a rival prince to defeat. The treaty was a crown, but it was a double-edged one. It gave him legitimacy, but it also gave him a legacy of war and rebellion. You can almost feel the weight of this new burden on his shoulders. He is no longer just the King of England. He is the regent of France. He has to govern two nations at once, a daunting and near impossible task. He has to balance the needs of his English subjects with the needs of his new French ones. He has to deal with a nobility that is still resentful, a populace that is still hostile, and a prince who is still a threat. The Treaty of Troy, while a triumph, was also the beginning of the end. It was a brilliant move, but it was a move that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The final years of Henry's reign were a blur of constant activity. He was a king in perpetual motion, travelling between England and France, dealing with rebellions, and trying to secure his new crown. He was not a king who could simply sit on a throne and rule. He was a king who had to constantly fight, to constantly prove that he was worthy of the title. The peace that the Treaty of Troyes had promised was a mirage. The war was not over. It had simply shifted to a new and even more complicated phase. The Duke of Burgundy, Henry's new ally, was a powerful force, but he was also a man with his own ambitions. The alliance was a marriage of convenience, not a true friendship. The French people, meanwhile, were tired of war. They were exhausted by the constant fighting, the sieges, and the famines. The English were a foreign power, and even a pious and just king like Henry V was still a foreign king. The quiet, simmering resentment of a conquered people was a far more formidable enemy than any army he had ever faced. And so, as you stand there, watching Henry V, the man who had conquered a kingdom, you can feel the quiet dread that is beginning to creep into his reign. He has won the battle, but he has yet to win the war. The crown that he has just acquired is not a symbol of triumph. It is a symbol of a burden that will ultimately be too heavy to bear. The Treaty of Troyes was a victory, but it was a victory that sealed his fate and the fate of his young son. The king had won the game, but he had yet to realise that the rules had changed and the game was far from over. The ink is dry on the Treaty of Troyes, and the double-edged crown of France has been placed firmly on Henry V's head. You're no longer in a ceremonial hall, you're on a ship, crossing the channel again and again, a silent witness to a king's relentless, exhausting life. The war is not over. It has simply evolved from a campaign of conquest into a Sisyphean struggle of governance. Henry V is no longer just a warrior king. He is a king who must be everywhere at once, a man who is trying to hold two kingdoms together with sheer force of will, and you can feel the immense pressure bearing down on him. The historical fact is that Henry V's reign as regent of France was an administrative and logistical nightmare. He had to constantly travel between England, his home base, and source of men and money, and France, his new and rebellious territory. He spent a significant portion of his final years trying to secure his new crown, putting down small-scale rebellions, negotiating with recalcitrant nobles, and trying to win the hearts and minds of a deeply hostile populace. He was, to put it simply, a king in perpetual motion, a man who could not rest. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about this period is the surprising resilience of the French. Despite the Treaty of Troyes and the power of Henry V, the French Dauphin, Charles, was still a rallying point for a significant portion of the country. He was, for all intents and purposes, a king without a kingdom, but he was also a symbol of French resistance. His agents and his small but dedicated army were a constant thorn in Henry's side, launching raids, ambushing patrols, and keeping the flame of French patriotism alive. It was a silent, simmering war that was far more difficult to fight than a simple battle. This leads us to a point of scholarly debate that still rages among historians. Historians still argue whether Henry V's attempt to govern both kingdoms was an act of supreme confidence or a fatal miscalculation. Was he a man who genuinely believed he could unite the two crowns and rule them with justice and piety? Or was he a man who was so driven by ambition that he had bitten off more than he could possibly chew? The sheer logistical demands of governing two kingdoms were immense, and it's a testament to his administrative genius that he was able to do it for as long as he did. But it was also an exhausting, demoralising and ultimately unsustainable task. Henry's approach to ruling France was a mix of brutal efficiency and surprising magnanimity. He was a king who understood that a conquest was not just about winning a battle, it was about winning the peace. He established a professional, efficient administration in the conquered territories, a system of justice and order that was a stark contrast to the chaos of the French court. He was, in many ways, a better king for the French than their own king, Charles VI, who was still suffering from bouts of madness. But for all his efforts, Henry was still an English king ruling a French people. The language barrier, the cultural differences, and the deep, abiding resentment of the French made his task a near impossible one. You can almost feel the grinding exhaustion of his final years. He's no longer the invincible warrior of Agincourt. He is a king who is constantly on guard, constantly under threat, and constantly dealing with the small, petty annoyances of governing a conquered people. He's a man who is not just fighting an army, he's fighting a way of life. The French, for their part, were a people who had been defeated in battle, but they had not been defeated in spirit. They were a people who were willing to endure, to resist, and to wait for their moment. The death of Henry's ally, the Duke of Burgundy, was a massive blow to his cause. The new Duke, Philip the Good, was a man with his own ambitions, and his alliance with the English was always a fragile one. Henry was also dealing with a restive English Parliament, which was growing tired of the endless war and the constant need for money. The triumph of Agincourt was a distant memory, and the harsh realities of governing a conquered kingdom were beginning to take their toll. The greatest irony of all is that the king who had so brutally and so effectively conquered France was a king who was ultimately defeated by a much smaller and far more insidious enemy, disease. He was a man who had faced down thousands of French knights, but he was no match for the dysentery that would ultimately claim his life. It was a cruel twist of fate, a final, stunning act of defiance from a kingdom that he had tried so hard to conquer. And so, as you stand there, watching the king in perpetual motion, you can feel the quiet dread that is beginning to creep into his reign. He has won the battle, but he is losing the war. The crown that he has just acquired is not a symbol of triumph. It is a symbol of a burden that is ultimately too heavy to bear. The king had won the game, but he had yet to realise that the rules had changed, and the game was far from over. The reign of the great warrior king was drawing to a close, not with a bang, but with a quiet and tragic whimper. The king's life has become a relentless struggle. You're no longer just an observer of grand battles and political manoeuvring. You're a silent shadow in Henry V's inner court, witnessing the constant, insidious threat of conspiracy and rebellion. The double-edged crown of France, once a symbol of his triumph, is now a heavy burden, a target that seems to attract enemies from every side. The peace that the Treaty of Troyes had promised is a mirage, and the king is a man who must constantly be on guard, a sentry in his own kingdom. The historical fact is that Henry V's later years were marked by a series of ongoing plots and rebellions, both in England and in France. His success had not silenced his enemies, it had merely driven them underground. In England, the Lollards, the religious reform movement we spoke of earlier, were still a threat. They had been crushed, but they had not been eliminated. Their leader, Sir John Oldcastle, was still at large, a constant thorn in Henry's side. He was finally captured and executed in 1417, but his rebellion was a stark reminder that even a victorious king could not afford to be complacent. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about this period is the sheer audacity of some of the plots against Henry V. In 1415, just before the Agincourt campaign, a plot known as the Southampton Plot was uncovered. The conspirators, including Richard, Earl of Cambridge, and Sir Thomas Grey, planned to assassinate Henry and replace him with Edmund Mortimer, a man with a more legitimate claim to the throne through the old Plantagenet line. The plot was uncovered, and the conspirators were executed, but the very existence of such a plot, at such a crucial moment, shows just how precarious Henry's position was. It was a clear signal that not all of England was celebrating his reign. This leads us to a point of scholarly debate that still rages among historians. Historians still argue whether the constant threat of rebellion and conspiracy made Henry V a more ruthless ruler, or if his ruthlessness was a natural part of his character from the very beginning. Did the Southampton Plot and the ongoing Lollard rebellions force him to become a man who was willing to do whatever it took to maintain order? Or was he a man who had always believed in the brutal efficiency of power and the rebellions were just an excuse to unleash a side of himself that he had always kept hidden. The fact is, Henry V was not a king who was known for his mercy. He was a king who was known for his quiet, formidable determination, and a man who was willing to use any means necessary to secure his power. In France, the threat of rebellion was even more persistent and insidious. The French Dauphin, Charles, had set up a rival court in southern France, a pocket of resistance that would plague the English for years to come. He was not a great military leader, but he was a symbol of French patriotism, a man who refused to give in. His agents were everywhere, stirring up rebellion, launching raids, and keeping the flame of French nationalism alive. Henry was no longer fighting a united army. He was fighting a guerrilla war, a constant grinding struggle against an unseen enemy. You can almost feel the grinding frustration of his final years. He is no longer the invincible conqueror of Agincourt. He is a king who is constantly on guard, constantly under threat, and constantly dealing with the small, petty annoyances of governing a conquered people. He is a man who is not just fighting an army, he is fighting a way of life. The French, for their part, were a people who had been defeated in battle, but they had not been defeated in spirit. They were a people who were willing to endure, to resist, and to wait for their moment. The death of Henry's ally, the Duke of Burgundy, was a massive blow to his cause. The new Duke, Philip the Good, was a man with his own ambitions, and his alliance with the English was always a fragile one. Henry was also dealing with a restive English Parliament, which was growing tired of the endless war and the constant need for money. The triumph of Agincourt was a distant memory, and the harsh realities of governing a conquered kingdom were beginning to take their toll. The greatest irony of all is that the king who had so brutally and so effectively conquered France was a king who was ultimately defeated by a much smaller and far more insidious enemy, disease. He was a man who had faced down thousands of French knights, but he was no match for the dysentery that would ultimately claim his life. It was a cruel twist of fate, a final, stunning act of defiance from a kingdom that he had tried so hard to conquer. And so, as you stand there, watching the king in perpetual motion, you can feel the quiet dread that is beginning to creep into his reign. He has won the battle, but he is losing the war. The crown that he has just acquired is not a symbol of triumph. It is a symbol of a burden that is ultimately too heavy to bear. The king had won the game, but he had yet to realise that the rules had changed, and the game was far from over. The reign of the great warrior king was drawing to a close, not with a bang, but with a quiet and tragic whimper. The relentless pace of Henry V's life has finally begun to take its toll. You're no longer a shadow in his bustling court. You're in a quiet, solemn room in a royal residence in France. The air once filled with the clang of swords and the roar of a king's command is now still and heavy. Henry V, the man who seemed invincible, lies in bed, ravaged by disease. He is not a warrior anymore. He is a tired, sick man, his body failing him in the prime of his life. His most formidable enemy, the dysentery that had decimated his army at Harfleur, has finally caught up with him. And in his final moments, his greatest concern is not for himself, but for the lasting legacy he is about to leave. The historical fact is that Henry V died at the age of 35, at the peak of his power and ambition. His death, on August 31st, 1422, was a shocking and unexpected blow to the English. He had achieved the impossible. He had conquered France, secured his place in history, and a son, the future Henry VI, had just been born. His death was a tragic and cruel twist of fate. It was a moment that not only ended the reign of a great king, but also threw a fragile empire into a state of utter chaos. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about his death is that he died far from home in a small town called Vincennes in France. He was in the middle of a campaign, a king in perpetual motion, and he never made it back to the kingdom he had fought so hard to secure. His death in a foreign land was a poignant end to a life that had been defined by a constant back and forth between England and France. It was a final tragic irony for a man who had dedicated his life to uniting the two nations. This leads us to a point of scholarly debate that still rages among historians. Historians still argue whether Henry V's sudden death was a catastrophic blow to the English cause or an inevitability. The traditional narrative, of course, is that if Henry had lived, he would have secured the English claim to the French throne and changed the course of European history forever. His genius, his charisma, and his iron will were what held the fragile empire together. His death, in this view, was the moment everything began to fall apart. But what if it wasn't? What if the empire he had built was always a house of cards? What if the French resistance was too strong, the logistical demands too immense, and the English Parliament too tired of war to sustain his ambitious plans? Perhaps his death was not a tragedy, but a grim inevitability. Henry's final acts were a testament to his character. In his dying moments, he gathered his council around him and gave them his final instructions. He appointed his brother, the Duke of Bedford, as the regent of France. He appointed his other brother, the Duke of Gloucester, as the regent of England, and he left his infant son, the future king of both England and France, in their care. He was a king who was thinking about legacy, not about himself. He was a man who understood that his work was not done, and that his greatest challenge was not to win a battle, but to leave a kingdom that would endure. You can almost feel the weight of this burden on the shoulders of his young son. The future Henry VI was not even a year old when his father died. He was a king who would never know his father, a king who would inherit not a peaceful kingdom, but a fractured empire. He would be king of two nations, a title that would prove to be an unbearable burden. He would spend his life trying to hold a crumbling empire together, a task that would ultimately drive him to the brink of madness and lead to a new era of civil war in England, the bloody Wars of the Roses. The legacy of Henry V, therefore, is not a simple one. He was a man who achieved the impossible, a king who transformed England from a second-rate power into a European superpower. But he was also a man who left a legacy of war, of fractured loyalties, and of a crown that was too heavy for his son to bear. He was a great warrior, but his greatest victory was also his greatest failure. He had won the battle, but he had lost the war for a lasting peace. The French, for their part, rejoiced at his death. Their greatest enemy was gone, and they were finally free to fight among themselves again. The Dauphin, the man who Henry had tried so hard to disinherit, was now the legitimate heir to the French throne. The tide of the war had turned, and the French were finally on the path to reclaiming their country. The death of Henry VIII was not just the end of a king's reign. It was the beginning of a new chapter in a long, brutal war, a chapter that would eventually lead to the rise of a new French hero, a young peasant girl who would one day change the course of history. But that's a story for another night. And so, as the silent, solemn procession begins its long, heartbreaking journey back to England, you can feel the quiet dread of a kingdom that has just lost its king. The warrior is gone, and a new, fragile era has begun. The burden of a father's legacy has been placed on a son's shoulders, a burden that will prove to be an impossible one to bear. The reign of the great warrior king is over, but the consequences of his ambition are just beginning. The silence is absolute now, the quiet that follows a storm. The great warrior king is dead. You're not in a solemn chamber anymore. You're on the long, heartbreaking journey back to England. The procession is a sombre, silent affair. Henry V's body, embalmed and wrapped in fine linens, is carried on a magnificent hearse, pulled by a team of black horses. The air is filled with the sound of muffled drums and the quiet weeping of his soldiers. This is not the triumphant return of a conqueror. It is the final journey of a man who had won the world but had lost his life in the process. The historical fact is that Henry V's funeral procession was a magnificent and poignant spectacle, a final act of a king who understood the power of symbolism. The procession, which travelled for months through France and back to England, was a deliberate piece of political theatre. It was a clear signal to the French that even in death, Henry V was still their king, and his claim to their throne was still valid. It was a final, stunning act of defiance from a man who had been defeated by a disease, but not by a king. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about this period is the surprising and almost comical sight of a life-sized effigy of Henry V, complete with his crown and a sceptre, lying on top of his coffin. This was a common practice in medieval royal funerals, a way to show that the king, even in death, was still a king. The effigy was so lifelike that it was said to have spooked many a bystander, a final eerie reminder of the quiet, formidable man who had once ruled them. This leads us to a point of scholarly debate that still rages among historians. Historians still argue whether Henry V's death was a moment of liberation for the French or a moment of profound sadness for the English. The traditional narrative, of course, is that the French rejoiced at his death. Their greatest enemy was gone, and they were finally free to fight among themselves again. But what if it wasn't? What if the French, for all their resentment, had also come to respect and even admire the man who had brought them a semblance of order and peace? And what about the English? Did they grieve for a king who had brought them so much glory, but had also cost them so much in men and money? The truth, as is often the case, is far more complex. The death of Henry V was a moment of both relief and profound uncertainty for both nations. The procession finally reaches London, and the city, which had once erupted in a joyous celebration, is now silent and sombre. The hearse is carried through the streets to Westminster Abbey, the final resting place of kings. Henry V is buried in a magnificent tomb, a testament to the life of a man who had transformed England and had tried to conquer the world. He's a king who will be remembered not just for his victories, but for his quiet, formidable determination, for his unwavering faith, and for his impossible ambition. The legacy he left behind was a mixed one. He had won the battle, but he had lost the war for a lasting peace. He had left his son with a kingdom that was far bigger, but far more fragile than the one he had inherited. The crown of France, once a prize, was now a burden, and the young Henry VI would spend his life trying to hold on to a crown that was never truly his. The Wars of the Roses, the bloody civil war that would tear England apart, were a direct result of the fragile legitimacy of the Lancastrian line, a legitimacy that Henry V had tried so hard to secure. But for all his failures, Henry V's legacy is a lasting one. He was a king who had transformed England from a second-rate power into a European superpower. He had united his country under a single purpose, and he had given them a sense of national pride that had been missing for generations. He was a king who was a brilliant military strategist, a shrewd politician, and a pious, formidable leader. He was, to put it simply, a king who had changed the course of history. As the sun sets, and you stand there, in the silent, hallowed halls of Westminster Abbey, you can feel the weight of his legacy. The great warrior king is gone, but the story of his life, the story of his wild youth, his impossible victory and his tragic death, is a story that will never be forgotten. It is a story of a man who was willing to do whatever it took to win, a man who was willing to gamble his entire kingdom on a single impossible battle. It is a story of a king who had won the world but had lost his life in the process. Now, let the final image of the warrior king, silent and sombre in his magnificent tomb, fade into the shadows. The long bloody journey is over. The roar of the battle is a distant memory. The whispers of the court have long since died. The great king is at rest. The final embers of the hearth have turned to ash, and the castle is quiet. The great story of Henry V is now a memory, a tale of a boy who became a king, a man who conquered a kingdom, and a king who ultimately fell to a foe he could not defeat. His legacy, like his reign, was brief but monumental, a testament to a life lived with an impossible fire and an unwavering purpose. The weight of history, once so heavy, now feels as light as a feather. The whispers of the past are now a gentle hum in the darkness. You can let go of the clang of swords and the shouts of battle. The journey is over. The warrior king is at peace, and so should you be.